The chandeliers wept crystal tears, their light fracturing across the suffocating opulence of the Grand Astoria ballroom. An ocean of black ties and silk gowns shifted below, a murmuring tide of New York's elite, to Alara Vance. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition, was a familiar poison. She moved through it with the practiced grace of a predator in her own jungle, her smile a perfectly calibrated instrument, her posture an impenetrable fortress. For 2 decades, she had been the architect, the city's most formidable litigator, a woman who built cases with such meticulous precision that they were not so much won as unveiled. Her reputation was her armor, forged in the sterile tension of corporate boardrooms and the hushed violence of courtroom battles. Tonight, however, was for charity. The annual Vanguard Foundation Gala was the apex of the philanthropic season, a night where fortunes were pledged and reputations were polished. Alara was here as a board member, a testament to her standing. She navigated the currents of polite conversation, her mind a step ahead of every pleasantry, cataloging the subtle shifts in power, the alliances forming and dissolving in the space of a handshake. Then she saw him, Julian Thorne. He was holding court near the stage, a magnetic center of gravity in a room full of powerful people. He laughed, a deep, resonant sound that drew people closer, and gestured with a casual elegance that belied the ruthlessness she knew lay beneath. To the world, he was a visionary, a self-made titan of industry who now dedicated his immense wealth to noble causes. To Alara, he was a ghost from a life she had meticulously buried. Their eyes met across the glittering expanse. His smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something ancient and cold passed through it. It was a look of recognition, of shared history, of a wound that had never truly healed. A knot of ice formed in Alara's stomach, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement and turned away, hoping to be lost in the crowd. But Julian was not a man who allowed others to dictate the terms of engagement. Later, as the evening's host introduced him as the keynote speaker and newest recipient of the Vanguard Humanitarian Award, a hush fell over the ballroom. Julian ascended the stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight. He was a master of the public stage, his charisma a palpable force. "Thank you," he began, his voice smooth as velvet. "I am humbled to be in the company of so many generous and influential people. People who build, who create, who strive to leave the world better than they found it." His eyes scanned the room, and, for a heart-stopping moment, they landed directly on Alara. "We all face challenges in our work, in our lives," he continued, his tone shifting to one of cozy intimacy. "We all make difficult choices. Sometimes, we have to make sacrifices. Sometimes, we have to simplify complex situations for the greater good. It reminds me of my early days, working with brilliant, ambitious colleagues, people who could build the most beautiful, intricate structures." The room was rapt. Alara felt a cold sweat prickle the back of her neck. She knew where this was going. "But even the most brilliant architect," Julian said, his smile now laced with something sharp, "must be careful, because if you remove just one supporting pillar, believing the structure is strong enough to stand on its own, well, the entire thing can come crashing down, sometimes with tragic consequences." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It's a lesson in humility, a lesson some of us learn the hard way." To the rest of the audience, it was a generic, mildly philosophical anecdote. But for Alara, it was a precision strike. He had just referenced the Argent case, the single greatest failure of her career, the tragedy that had shattered her world and from which Julian had emerged, seemingly unscathed, to build his empire. He was talking about Robert Argent, their mentor, their friend, the man whose death had been the foundation of both their careers, in very different ways. The pillar he had just mentioned was not stone or steel, it was a man's life. The polite applause that followed his speech was a roar in Alara's ears. Her carefully constructed composure, the product of 20 years of disciplined emotional suppression, began to crack. A memory, vivid and unwanted, broke through the surface of her control. The sterile white of a hospital room, the rhythmic, agonizing beep of a heart monitor, the scent of antiseptic failing to mask the smell of despair. Julian, younger, his face a mask of raw grief, turning to her with eyes full of accusation. "You did this, Ilara," he had whispered, his voice ragged. "Your ambition. You took out the pillar." Ilara gripped the stem of her wineglass, her knuckles white. She could feel the stares, the curious glances from those who knew of her past association with Julian. They would see his words as a playful jab at an old rival, a bit of inside baseball. But she knew it for what it was, a public declaration. He was not finished with her. He was coming to tear down the structure she had spent a lifetime building. For a fleeting moment, she was no longer the architect, the titan of law. She was a 28-year-old lawyer again, standing in the wreckage of her life, with the ghost of a dead man at her feet and the weight of a silent accusation in the air. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the memory back into its cage, and raised her glass in a silent, ironic toast to the man on the stage. The war had just been reignited, not with a bang, but with a polite, devastatingly cruel joke. Alara's apartment was a monument to control, perched high above Central Park. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city. Yet, inside, everything was sterile perfection. White walls, minimalist furniture in shades of gray, and not a single object out of place. It was less a home than a headquarters, a place designed to quiet the chaos of the world and the chaos within. Her life was a series of meticulously managed compartments: her career, her board memberships, her public persona. The one compartment she could never quite get right was her daughter, Maya. The call came, as it always did, at precisely 9 o'clock. "Hi, Mom." Maya's voice was flat, tinged with the familiar adolescent apathy that Alara found more baffling than any legal contract. "Maya, darling, how was your day?" Alara asked, her tone consciously warm as she paced the length of her living room. "Fine. School was school." A pause. "Did you see the new Thorn Foundation post? They're funding a STEM program for underprivileged girls. Pretty cool." Alara's jaw tightened. "Julian, ever the saint." "That's wonderful," she said, the words tasting like ash. "How is your calculus project coming along?" "It's fine," Maya repeated, the conversation already circling the drain of disinterest. "Listen, I have to go. Group study." "Of course, I love you." "Yeah, you too." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Maya lived with her father, Alara's ex-husband, in a sprawling, comfortable house in Westchester. It had been a mutual decision after the divorce. Alara's schedule was too demanding, her world too intense for a child. But with each passing year, the physical distance had become an emotional chasm. Maya saw her mother as a name on a letterhead, a face on a charity gala program, a powerful but remote figure. She had no concept of the woman beneath the armor, nor of the sacrifices made in her name. On Alara's polished mahogany desk, nestled between legal briefs and financial reports, was a single, framed photograph. It was old, the colors slightly faded. Three young, smiling faces looked out from the frame, a 20-something Alara, her hair shorter, her eyes bright with an idealism she could no longer recognize. Julian, handsome and confident even then, and in the middle, his arm around both of them, Robert Argent. Robert had been their mentor at the prestigious firm of Sterling and Croft, a legal giant with a booming laugh and a brilliant mind. He had taken them under his wing, two hungry associates from opposite sides of the tracks, and seen in them a spark of greatness. He had called them his architects of justice. Julian's words at the gala had dislodged this memory from its dusty corner of her mind. The Argent case had been their first major project together, a complex corporate fraud case that was supposed to make their careers. Instead, it had ended them. The details were a blur of late nights, caffeine-fueled strategy sessions, and the growing, thrilling sense that they were on the verge of a landmark victory. And then, the collapse. Robert Argent, accused of tampering with evidence, had taken his own life before the case went to trial. The firm had buried the scandal. Julian had left to start his own venture capital firm with a mysterious influx of funding. And Alara had stayed, working tirelessly to rebuild her reputation from the rubble, eventually leaving to start her own practice. She had never spoken to Julian again, until now. A subtle chime from her encrypted email drew her attention. It was from David Chen, her longtime colleague and the closest thing she had to a friend. David was the firm's moral compass, a cautious, brilliant lawyer who had been with her since the beginning. Subject: Gala. Message. His speech was out of line. Are you all right? Alara typed a quick reply. Subject: Re-Gala. Message: perfectly fine. He's always enjoyed the sound of his own voice. Nothing more. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Julian Thorne did nothing without a purpose. His jab at the gala was not a stray comment. It was the opening salvo. She just didn't know what he was aiming for yet. The attack came 3 days later, and it was more devastating than she could have imagined. It arrived not as a lawsuit or a corporate maneuver, but as an exposé, a front-page story in the New York Chronicle. The headline was a masterpiece of insinuation. The architect's flaw. Did Alara Vance build a career on a lie? The article, penned by a respected investigative journalist, detailed her current landmark case, a class-action lawsuit against the pharmaceutical giant Omnicorp. Alara was representing thousands of families whose lives had been ravaged by a faulty heart medication. The piece, however, focused on a key witness, a former Omnicorp scientist who had recently recanted part of his testimony. It then presented a series of leaked, heavily redacted internal emails from Alara's firm, taken out of context. They appeared to show Alara pressuring the witness, manipulating his statement to fit her narrative. The implication was clear: Alara Vance, the champion of justice, was guilty of witness tampering, the very accusation that had destroyed Robert Argent. Worse, the article dredged up the Argent case, framing it not as a past tragedy, but as a pattern of behavior. It quoted an anonymous source close to the original investigation, who claimed that Alara's ambition often blinded her to ethical lines. The source could only be Julian. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The judge on the Omnicorp case called an emergency hearing. Her clients, panicked and confused, flooded the firm's phone lines. Her partners looked at her with a new, corrosive doubt in their eyes. Julian hadn't just attacked her case. He had attacked the very foundation of her identity. He had taken her greatest strength, her unimpeachable integrity, and turned it into a weapon against her. This was no random attack. This was a declaration of war. It was personal, meticulously planned, and aimed directly at her soul. The ghost of Robert Argent was no longer a distant memory. Julian had resurrected him and placed him squarely in the center of her life, a specter sent to burn it all to the ground. Alara stood in her office, the newspaper spread out on her desk like a death sentence, and felt a cold, hard clarity settle over her. The rules of engagement had been set. The time for defense was over. It was time to build a new kind of case. Alara's first instinct was to fight back within the system she had mastered. She called an emergency meeting with the firm's senior partners, laying out a strategy to file for an injunction against the Chronicle, to subpoena the journalist for his sources, to launch a public relations counteroffensive. She was the architect. She would deconstruct this attack piece by piece and expose it as the malicious fabrication it was. But for the first time in her career, the walls she expected to be solid were made of sand. "Alara, we have to consider the optics," said Marcus Thorne. "No relation to Julian, but the firm's oldest and most risk-averse partner. Suing the press makes us look like we're hiding something. We need to cooperate fully with the Bar Association's inquiry," added another partner, avoiding her gaze. "Any hint of stonewalling will be disastrous." They were afraid. Julian's attack had been too precise, too damaging. He hadn't just smeared her. He had made her radioactive. They saw the potential loss of clients, the damage to the firm's brand, the years of litigation ahead. They saw risk, and they were retreating. Her next move was to approach the Bar Association's Ethics Committee, hoping to get ahead of the official inquiry. She met with an old colleague, a man she had known for 30 years, who now sat on the board. He listened patiently, his face a mask of professional sympathy, but his words were a death knell. "The allegations are serious, Alara," he said, stirring his coffee, especially with the echoes of the Argent matter. "Julian Thorne sits on two of the city's most powerful charitable boards alongside Judge Albright, who, as you know, chairs our disciplinary panel. His influence is significant." The message was clear. Julian had spent 2 decades not just building a business empire, but weaving a web of influence that extended into the very institutions Alara relied on for justice. He had allies in places she couldn't see, people who owed him favors, people who feared his power. The official channels were compromised. The game was rigged. She left the meeting feeling a chilling sense of isolation. The system she had dedicated her life to, the rules she had played by and mastered, had been turned against her. She was boxed in, her reputation bleeding out from 1,000 paper cuts, her professional allies backing away into the shadows. That evening, as she sat in her silent apartment, the city lights twinkling below like a cold, indifferent constellation, she realized the truth. Julian wanted to destroy her by making her relive the Argent case. But this time, he wanted her to be utterly alone. He wanted her to feel the same powerlessness that Robert must have felt in his final days. A flicker of the old rage, the one she had buried after Robert's death, ignited within her. It was a cold fire, not of passion, but of pure, unadulterated resolve. If they would not let her win by the rules, she would write new ones. She had spent her life building cases. Now, she would build a weapon. She unlocked a secure folder on her laptop and pulled up a name she hadn't needed in over a decade. A name she kept for emergencies, for situations where the law was not enough. Lena Petrova, Private Investigations, Discretion Guaranteed. Lena operated out of a cramped office in a less fashionable part of Brooklyn, a world away from Alara's polished Manhattan existence. The air in her office smelled of stale coffee and burnt electronics. Lena herself was sharp angles and sharper eyes. A woman who looked like she had seen the worst of the world and was entirely unimpressed by it. "Alara Vance," Lena said, leaning back in her creaky chair without getting up. It's been a while. I thought you'd gone completely legitimate. I need you to look into someone for me, Alara said, ignoring the jibe and placing a file on the cluttered desk. Julian Thorne. Lena picked up the file but didn't open it. Her gaze was unnervingly direct. Thorne's a public saint. Humanitarian of the year. What do you want to find? Anything, Alara said, her voice low and steady. Everything. His finances, his business dealings, his philanthropy. I want to know where every dollar comes from, and where every dollar goes. I want to know what he's hiding. Lena finally opened the file, her eyes scanning the first page. This is big game hunting. Alara. It's going to be expensive. And it's going to be dangerous. Thorne doesn't play nice. I'm aware, Alara said. I'm not playing nice anymore either. Lena closed the file and looked at Alara, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. Good, she said. It's about time you remembered how to fight. Alara left the office and stepped out into the gritty Brooklyn night. The air was different here, alive with the sounds and smells of a city that didn't sleep. For the first time since the gala, she felt a sense of agency, of control. The fortress of her life had been breached, her armor pierced. But now, she was stepping out of the ruins, not as a victim, but as a hunter. The weeks that followed were a grueling war fought on two fronts. By day, Alara was the consummate professional, fighting a desperate legal battle to save the Omnicorp case and her own career. She worked tirelessly, drafting motions, preparing affidavits, and projecting an aura of unwavering confidence to her clients and colleagues. But by night, she descended into the shadows with Lena Petrova, meticulously deconstructing the life of Julian Thorne. Lena was a master of her craft, a phantom who moved through the digital and physical worlds with equal ease. She peeled back the layers of Julian's empire, revealing a complex network of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and charitable foundations that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. He's clean. Almost too clean. Lena reported during one of their late-night meetings, her face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. His flagship company, Thorne Ventures, is a fortress. But the money for his foundation, it's a labyrinth. Funds are moved through a dozen different entities before they land in the charity's accounts. It's legal, on the surface. But it's the kind of accounting you use when you want to wash money, not donate it. While Lena chased the money, Alara chased memories, forcing herself to revisit the painful terrain of the Argent case. She spent hours in her firm's archives, sifting through boxes of old files, the crisp scent of aging paper, a trigger for a past she had tried to forget. The case files told the story she remembered: a brilliant legal strategy, mounting evidence, and then the sudden, inexplicable implosion. But there were gaps, missing pieces that had never made sense. Meanwhile, her relationship with Maya deteriorated further. Her daughter saw the headlines, heard the whispers. To her, it was simple, her powerful, absentee mother was in trouble, and the kind, charismatic Mr. Thorne, who was funding her school's new science lab, was the one being wronged. My friends are asking me about that article. Mom, Maya said during one strained phone call. They're saying you cheated to win a case. Is that what you do? The accusation, delivered with the blunt cruelty only a teenager can muster, struck Alara harder than any legal motion. It's not true, Maya, Alara said, her voice tight. It's complicated. Everything with you is complicated, Maya shot back before hanging up. Alara found a sliver of support in an unexpected place. David Chen, her moral compass, stood by her, even as others in the firm kept their distance. He didn't approve of her hiring Lena, but he understood her desperation. "Be careful, Alara," he warned her one evening, finding her alone in the archives. "This path you're on, it can change you. Don't become him to beat him." "What choice do I have?" "David," she replied, her voice weary. "He's left me no other ground to fight on." "There's always a choice," he said softly. He had been there, back at Sterling and Croft. He had seen the toll the Argent case had taken on her. He was worried he was watching a sequel. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Lena, frustrated by the digital maze of Julian's finances, had started digging into his personal life. She found something small, a detail that seemed insignificant at first. Every year, on the anniversary of Robert Argent's death, Lena told Alara, her voice crackling over the encrypted line, "A significant, anonymous donation is made to the Argent Memorial Scholarship Fund at Columbia Law School. The donation is untraceable, channeled through the same kind of shell company he uses for his foundation." A chill went down Alara's spine. A scholarship fund. Robert had no children, no family to set up such a thing. "Pull the fund's charter," Alara ordered. "I want to know who founded it." An hour later, Lena called back. "You're not going to believe this. The fund was established 20 years ago. The founder is listed as a blind trust, but the lawyer who filed the paperwork was Julian Thorne." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture that was darker and more personal than Alara had ever imagined. This wasn't just about a professional rivalry. This wasn't just about a past failure. This was about grief. This was about blame. Driven by a new, urgent theory, Alara returned to the archives. She wasn't looking for case files anymore. She was looking for personal correspondence, for anything that could shed light on Julian's state of mind in the weeks after Robert's death. Deep in a box of miscellaneous documents, she found a thin file containing interoffice memos from that period, and, inside, a single sheet of paper she had never seen before, or had forced herself to forget. It was a copy of a memo from Julian to one of the senior partners, dated the day after Robert's funeral. It was a formal request for a leave of absence, but the last paragraph was a barely concealed accusation. "I cannot, in good conscience," Julian had written, "continue to work on a case whose ethical integrity has been so thoroughly compromised." Robert's dedication was absolute, but he was surrounded by those whose ambition outpaced their judgment. He was a pillar, and he was deliberately removed to see if the structure would hold. "I will not be a party to celebrating that kind of architecture." He had used the exact same words as he had at the gala: pillar, structure, architecture. It was all there. The raw, searing grief, the carefully coded language of blame, the unshakable conviction that she, Alara, was responsible for the death of the man they had both loved like a father. Alara sank into a chair, the memo trembling in her hand. The entire conflict, the last 20 years of their separate lives, suddenly snapped into focus. Julian's vendetta wasn't born of professional jealousy or a lust for power. It was born of a wound. He truly, deeply believed she had killed Robert Argent, not with a weapon, but with her ambition. He saw her as a monster who had sacrificed their mentor for a win, and he had spent 2 decades building the power he needed to make her pay. The battle had just been recast. This was no longer just a fight for her career. It was a fight for the truth of her past, a fight against a ghost that had been hunting her for 20 years. Julian must have sensed her closing in. Perhaps one of his sources inside the firm warned him, or perhaps he simply felt the shift in pressure, the way a predator feels the hunter's gaze. His response was swift and brutal, and it was aimed at the one vulnerability she had left her daughter. He didn't threaten Maya physically, Julian was too smart for that. His attack was far more insidious. He became her hero. It began with the Thorn Foundation's new STEM mentorship program, the one Maya had mentioned on the phone. Julian made a personal appearance at Maya's school to launch the initiative. He was charming, inspirational, and funny. He spoke about overcoming adversity, about the importance of following your dreams. He singled out Maya's science club for praise, inviting them to a special tour of Thorn Ventures' advanced robotics lab. Maya was starstruck. Here was this brilliant, celebrated man taking a personal interest in her and her friends. He was everything her mother was not present, accessible, and seemingly invested in her world. Ilara watched from a distance, a helpless, cold fury building inside her. She saw photos online of Maya shaking Julian's hand, her face beaming. She heard from her ex-husband how Maya couldn't stop talking about Mr. Thorn and the amazing opportunities he was providing. Julian was systematically colonizing her daughter's life, positioning himself as a benevolent father figure while simultaneously destroying her mother. The psychological toll on Ilara was immense. Every night, she wrestled with the choice before her. To continue her fight against Julian meant risking further alienation from Maya. He had made her daughter a pawn in his twisted game of revenge. Forcing Ilara into a defensive crouch? Was her reputation, her career, worth the price of her child's affection? "He's poisoning her against me." "David," she confessed one night, the strain evident in her voice for the first time. They were in her office, the city lights a cold witness to her anguish. "Then you have to tell her the truth," David urged. "All of it. About Argent. About what Julian is doing. She's 16. Ilara. She's old enough to understand." "And say what? That the man her school is celebrating as a hero is a monster obsessed with a 20-year-old grudge, that her mother is locked in a secret war with him. She'll think I'm paranoid. She'll hate me even more for trying to tear down the one person who seems to care about her." The second obstacle had been erected, and it was a wall of her own daughter's making. Julian had found the perfect way to escalate by targeting not Ilara's career, but her heart. He was forcing her to question everything, to wonder if the revenge she sought was worth becoming the villain in her own daughter's story. The doubt was a poison, seeping into her resolve, making her question if victory was even possible, or if, by fighting, she was simply guaranteeing she would lose everything that truly mattered. The climax was set for the stage where the war had begun, the annual Vanguard Foundation Gala. A year had passed since Julian's first public attack. Now, he was not just a speaker, he was the guest of honor, set to receive the Foundation's highest prize, the prestigious Global Humanitarian of the Year Award, for his work in funding education and clean energy projects. The event would be live-streamed, broadcast to a global audience. It was to be the coronation of St. Julian, the final, gleaming coat of polish on his flawless public image. For Ilara, it was the perfect battlefield. She had spent months preparing for this night, working with Lena to assemble an arsenal of undeniable proof. They had the intricate financial records showing how Julian's charitable donations were first used to fund aggressive corporate takeovers, with only the laundered profits making their way to the foundation. They had sworn affidavits from 2 former Thorn Ventures executives, men Lena had tracked down in foreign countries, who detailed Julian's unethical business practices. But the final, critical piece of evidence had arrived just days before the gala. Lena, through a source deep inside a digital forensics firm, had acquired a ghost image of a hard drive from Robert Argent's old office computer, a drive that was supposed to have been destroyed 20 years ago. On it, buried in a corrupted file, was Robert's private journal. Reading it had been like a punch to the gut. The journal revealed the full, unvarnished truth of the Argent case. Robert, facing catastrophic personal debts from a gambling addiction Alara never knew he had. Was the one who had tampered with the evidence? He had been secretly feeding information to the opposing counsel in exchange for money. The journal was a litany of his guilt, his shame, and his despair. His death wasn't a result of pressure from the case. It was the final act of a man who couldn't live with what he'd done. But the most damning entry was the last one. Julian knows. Robert had written, "I confessed everything to him. He wanted to help me cover it up, to frame the associate on the other side. He wants to win at any cost. He's more ruthless than I ever was. I can't be a part of it. I can't let him do it. This is the only way out." The truth was staggering. Julian had known Robert was guilty. He had tried to help him frame an innocent person. His entire 20-year vendetta against Alara was not the product of misguided grief. It was a lie. A calculated, elaborate fiction he had constructed to bury his own complicity and preserve the heroic image of his mentor, the man he knew to be a fraud. Alara secured a ticket to the gala through an old acquaintance. A quiet favor called in. She arrived not as a board member, but as a spectator, a ghost at the feast. She found a seat in the back, the tension in the room a palpable entity. The air crackled with the flash of cameras, the murmur of the powerful. Julian took the stage to thunderous applause. He looked regal, a benevolent king accepting the adoration of his subjects. He spoke of hope, of progress, of the responsibility the powerful have to the powerless. It was a masterful performance. As his speech concluded, the moderator opened the floor for a few questions from the press. This was her moment. Alara stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. A camera operator, recognizing her, swung a spotlight in her direction. A gasp went through the room. "Alara Vance," the moderator said, his voice tight with surprise. "This is unexpected." "I have a question for Mr. Thorne," Alara said, her voice calm and clear. Amplified by the microphone, a technician rushed to her. She didn't look at the moderator. Her eyes were locked on Julian. His smile was frozen on his face, a mask of polished composure. But she could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. "Julian," she began, "you spoke tonight of responsibility. I'd like to take you back 20 years, to another lesson in responsibility, the Robert Argent case." A nervous murmur rippled through the audience. Julian's smile tightened. "That's ancient history. Alara, I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum." "I believe it is," she countered, her voice like steel. "Because for 20 years, you've built your saintly reputation on the grave of a man you claimed I betrayed. You've used his memory as a shield for your own ruthless ambition." She began to lay out her case, her voice never rising, her delivery as precise and devastating as a closing argument. She presented the evidence of his financial machinations, displaying documents on the large screens behind the stage that showed the flow of dark money into his foundation. She detailed the shell corporations, the hostile takeovers disguised as investments. Julian's face had gone pale. "These are baseless, desperate allegations from a disgraced lawyer." He stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Are they?" Alara asked coolly. "Then let's talk about Robert Argent." She paused, letting the silence stretch, the tension in the room becoming unbearable. "You've spent 2 decades blaming me for his death. But you and I both know the truth. You knew he was guilty. You knew he was the one who compromised the case. You knew, because he told you himself." Julian was cornered. He fell back on his last defense martyrdom. Robert Argent was a great man, he boomed, his voice filled with righteous fury. He was a titan of the law who was hounded into an early grave by the reckless ambition of others. You dare to slander his name here. Tonight. This was it, the moment for the final killing blow. Ilara had the digital copy of the journal on a tablet in her hand. She could put it on the screen for the world to see, expose Robert's corruption and Julian's lie in one fell swoop, and exonerate herself completely. But then, her eyes scanned the front row, and she saw her, Eleanor Argent, Robert's widow, a frail, elegant woman in her late 70s. She was there as Julian's honored guest. She had spent 20 years believing her husband was a flawed but brilliant man who had died a martyr. She looked up at the stage, her face a mask of confusion and pain, her entire world threatening to crumble. This was the secondary twist, the moral choice she hadn't anticipated. To achieve total victory, to clear her name beyond any shadow of a doubt, she would have to destroy this innocent woman's most cherished memory. She would have to shatter the foundation of her entire life, publicly, in front of the entire world. Ilara looked at Eleanor's face, then at the tablet in her hand. The flash of cameras was blinding. The silence of the room was deafening. In that split second, she made her choice. She would not become Julian. She would not sacrifice an innocent person for her own victory. She lowered the tablet. "You're right. Julian," she said, her voice softening, but still carrying a deadly weight. "Let's not slander a dead man. Let's talk about a living one." Instead of the journal, she displayed a different document on the screen. It was a chain of emails between a young Julian Thorne and the firm's IT department, dated the day after Robert's death. In them, Julian explicitly instructed the department to permanently delete and physically destroy Robert Argent's hard drive, claiming it was a request from the family to protect their privacy. "You didn't just know the truth, Julian," Ilara said, her voice ringing with moral authority. "You actively buried it. You suppressed evidence to protect yourself and build a lie you have lived for 20 years. You didn't do it to honor Robert. You did it to build your own myth on his ashes." It was enough. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. The evidence of suppressing evidence was irrefutable. The lie was exposed. The foundation of his carefully constructed sainthood crumbled into dust. Julian Thorne, the great humanitarian, stood on the stage, exposed not as a grieving friend, but as a manipulative fraud. The cameras flashed, capturing the slow, agonizing collapse of his empire in real time. Ilara had won, not with brute force, but with precision, and with a last-second act of mercy that defined her as everything he was not. The aftermath was a swift and brutal unraveling. Julian Thorne's world imploded. The live-streamed feed was cut, but not before millions had witnessed his public execution. In the ensuing chaos, his allies in the audience, the titans of industry and politics who had praised him moments before, melted away into the night, desperate to distance themselves from the wreckage. By morning, the Vanguard Foundation had rescinded his award, and federal investigators were announcing a full-scale inquiry into the finances of Thorne Ventures and its charitable arm. Julian's reputation was not just tarnished, it was vaporized. In the quiet backstage area, amidst the frantic whispers of event staff, Ilara saw Eleanor Argent being helped to a chair by a gala organizer. Ilara approached her cautiously. The older woman looked up, her eyes filled not with the anger Ilara had expected, but with a deep, weary understanding. "I always knew," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I knew Robert had his demons. I just chose to remember the man I loved. Thank you for not taking that from me." A simple, profound nod passed between them. It was an acknowledgement of a shared, complicated history, and a silent absolution. In that moment, Ilara knew she had made the right choice. She went home not to her sterile apartment, but to her ex-husband's house in Westchester. She arrived late, but a light was on. Maya was waiting up for her, sitting at the kitchen table, her phone dark beside her. She had watched the whole thing online. For the first time, there was no wall between them. The anger and resentment in Maya's eyes had been replaced by a raw, searching vulnerability. "Mom," she asked, her voice small. Alara sat down opposite her, the weight of the last 20 years settling between them. And she began to talk. She told her everything. About her youthful idealism, her friendship with Julian and Robert, about the crushing guilt she had carried over Robert's death, the parts of the story she had buried even from herself. She explained the complexity, the shades of gray, the painful truth that heroes and villains are often the same people. She didn't spare herself, admitting her own ambition, her own emotional distance, her failures as a mother. It was the most honest conversation they had ever had. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, Maya reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Not for winning, for how you did it." The chasm between them had finally begun to close. 6 months later, the city was a different place. Julian Thorne was facing a battery of federal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His empire was being dismantled, his name now a synonym for hypocrisy. Alara stood on a small stage in a newly renovated building on the campus of Columbia Law School. The autumn air was crisp, and the crowd before her was a mix of students, faculty, and legal professionals. Behind her, a simple bronze plaque read, "The Vance Argent Center for Legal Ethics." She had used her restored influence and a significant portion of her own wealth to establish it. It wasn't an act of triumph, but of healing, a way to honor the brilliant lawyer Robert Argent should have been, and to ensure that young, ambitious students understood that the most important pillar in any structure is integrity. Maya and David stood in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. For the first time in years, Alara felt a sense of profound peace. Her revenge was complete, not because she had destroyed her enemy, but because she had rebuilt herself. She had turned the source of her deepest pain into a force for good. That evening, back in her apartment, which now featured a few of Maya's vibrant paintings on the walls, splashes of life amidst the gray, a small, unassuming package was waiting for her. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was an old, leather-bound journal and a single, handwritten note on elegant stationery. She recognized the cursive immediately. It was from Eleanor Argent. "My dear Alara," the note began, "I thought you should have this. It is a story of a man's weakness, but also, I hope, a reminder of the strength you showed. Thank you for protecting his memory. Even when he didn't deserve it, you chose kindness. Robert would have been proud of the lawyer you became, and the woman you have always been." Alara opened the journal, the physical book, the tangible proof of the truth she had chosen to shield. Holding it, she felt the last vestiges of her own guilt, the final ghost of the Argent case, finally, mercifully, fade away. The validation she had sought for 20 years hadn't come from a public victory, but from a quiet act of grace. Her war was over. She was free.